Welcome, everyone. I won't say good afternoon for the same reason that I try not to ask people, how are you? Lately, it's a dark time not just for the Jewish community, but for all of humanity as we continue to learn more horrifying information about the atrocities that Hamas committed just days ago. We come together at a time when many in Israel and the United States and around the world are mourning, when Israel is preparing its response. But as activity is developing on American college campus, which is not in every instance supportive, I will say that there are some campuses where we have seen rallies in support of Israel and where we have seen expression of support for the victims as well as for the people of the state of Israel and the Jewish community. We've seen some strong statements from some university presidents, like President Ben Sasse of the University of Florida. Many elected officials have made strong supportive statements as well. And yet at the same time, there are others who either provide weak statements based on some misguided notion of moral equivalency, or worse, who are blaming the victim and saying things that suggest, if anything, that they are prepared to advocate for further violence against the Jewish people. On college campuses, we are hearing from students who are not just offended, but afraid. We hear from students who have been unwilling to go on campus or to class given the atmosphere of hostility that they are now facing with increasing force. And we are seeing mixed reactions by administrators to these problems. For our webinar today, we have three experts who will speak to the current situation on college campuses and with respect to the law, both domestic and international. Our own Director of Legal Initiatives, Denise Katz-Prober, will address the current situation on American college campuses. The Director of NJAC, the National Jewish Advocacy Center, our friend Mark Goldfeder, will speak to the international law, including international humanitarian law ramifications. After Mark Goldfeder, Aliza Lewin, President of the Louis D. Brandeis Center, we'll talk about the domestic legal issues involved and what universities can, should, and must do to address the threats on their campuses today. We will begin now with Denise Katz-Prober.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to our audience for joining us on this unfortunately important occasion. So I wanted to start by explaining that the Brandeis Center right now is being inundated with messages from Jewish and Israeli students on college and university campuses. The overarching message that we're hearing from them when we speak to them is that the climate on campus is significantly worse for Jewish and Israeli students this week since the Hamas terrorist assault on Israel began. And at the Brandeis Center, we, of course, have been speaking with students for years about anti-Semitic incidents, about feeling uncomfortable on campus, displaying Jewish identity because of a hostile climate. But there is a new sense of fear, which Ken alluded to in his opening remarks, fear about physical safety and violence erupting on campus that merits concern, and that I want to talk a little bit about and describe why students are feeling that way. Pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist groups like Students for Justice in Palestine and others on campus are sounding more aggressive in their language since the Hamas attacks this past weekend. These groups are openly and loudly supporting, celebrating, justifying, and glorifying last weekend's massacre of Jews and Israelis by Hamas. There have been public displays of support on U.S. college campuses for the atrocities perpetrated by Hamas, and they are often described by these groups as essentially or as legitimate Palestinian resistance. So, for instance, over 30 student organizations at Harvard University issued a joint statement saying that Israel is, quote, entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. Yaleys for Palestine at Yale, a student group, announced an event on Indigenous Peoples Day that they called All Out for Palestine. And the caption they put on social media was, "We call on our allies and the Yale community to celebrate the resistance's success, uplift their calls, and march this Monday, October 9th. The SJP at George Washington University posted images on social media that describe the events in Israel with the banner, "Decolonization is a violent phenomenon." At Stanford, there is reported chalking on the ground that stated outside of a classroom that stated, quote, "Resistance is justified when Israel is occupied. Gaza remembers." Bears for Palestine at UC Berkeley they have stated, "Taufan al-Aqsa now stands as a revolutionary moment in contemporary Palestinian resistance. We honor Palestinians who are working on the ground on several axes of the so-called Gaza envelope, alongside our comrades in blood and arms, and what is coming is greater. Victory or martyrdom. Gaza is the cradle of our resistance and the lifeblood of our struggle. We echo the call to action for all Arabs and Palestinians in the diaspora to rise up to support the liberation of our occupied peoples. From the river to the sea, we will continue to support resistance until we are able to return home to a unified Palestine. Glory to Palestine, glory to the resistance, and glory to our martyrs. Until return and liberation, Bears for Palestine at UC Berkeley." And a student president of NYU's Law Student Bar Association sent a message to NYU law students stating her, quote, "unwavering absolute solidarity with Palestinians in their resistance against oppression toward liberation and self-determination. Israel bears full responsibility for this tremendous loss of life." In addition, today, National Students for Justice in Palestine has declared a National Day of Resistance and called on its local SJP student chapters on campuses across the country to participate in this National Day of Resistance. National SJP published a resistance toolkit. It's intended to help student chapters of SJP with messaging and actions they should be taking on this day. And I may not have mentioned this day is today, Thursday, October 12th, is supposed to be SJP's National Day of Resistance. And in their toolkit, they describe the atrocities by Hamas as, quote, "a historic win for the Palestinian resistance." They refer to 75 years of occupation and the need for total return, quote, "total return and liberation of Palestine." Something important that we've noticed that I want to point out is that groups like SJP are using, well, as I said, more aggressive language, but it also appears to be calling for mobilization of students to action, inspiring students to join the Palestinian struggle as opposed to merely peaceful protests. So, for instance, in the National SJP toolkit I mentioned for their Day of Resistance, it states, "As the Palestinian student movement, we have an unshakable responsibility to join the call for mass mobilization. National liberation is near. Glory to our resistance, to our martyrs, and to our steadfast people." And this is after they describe the Hamas attacks as a historic win for the Palestinian resistance. Across land, air, and sea, our people have broken down the artificial barriers of the Zionist entity, taking with it the facade of an impenetrable settler colony and reminding each of us that total return and liberation to Palestine is near. So students, understandably, are deeply concerned about their physical safety, especially when local SJP chapters are planning events today to coincide with this National Day of Liberation. I would mention one more thing, which is that in a promotional poster for this National Day of Liberation, National SJP has a picture of a group of Palestinian protesters, presumably holding up signs that say resistance is our right, free Palestine, and Palestinian flags. And in the background is the image of a paraglider in the air. And of course, this is a depiction of the Hamas terrorists who paraglided into the desert music festival where Hamas then raped and murdered over 200 young people. as an example of the kinds of events that local SJB chapters are having or announcing on this day of resistance, the SJP at GMU posted about their emergency Palestine protests, support the resistance and end the occupation. Their caption states that the SJP Mason calls on the GMU community to support the struggle of our people against colonialism and the Zionist occupation. It is our duty to echo the calls for liberation in our homeland and our people from the river to the sea. Show up and show out for Palestine and let GMU know that we will rise against the occupation. So this is the kind of language, this is the kind of rhetoric that Jewish and Israeli students are hearing on campus while they're still reeling with grief and anguish and despair over events that are very personal for them. Many Jewish and Israeli students, of course, have family members, loved ones, friends who have been impacted by the violence or who are being called up to fight in Israel's military. One of the things that we're hearing from students is that these events, the event today by National SJP coincides with Hamas's call for a global jihad against Jews. And so that is adding to a very real sense of physical fear for students. We're hearing from students that, Jewish and Israeli students, that they are so afraid, specifically today and tomorrow especially, that they're going home, they're not staying on campus. They really are afraid that these events that celebrate and glorify Hamas violence will encourage further violence on campus. Another concern that we're hearing from Jewish students is that they are afraid to gather in large groups or places that might be identifiably Jewish spaces because they might be a target. We've heard of peaceful vigils being held by Jewish students for victims in Israel being disrupted by pro-Palestinian students who taunt them, who wave Palestinian flags, who chant Free Palestine or From the River to the Sea. We've even heard reports of some violence breaking out on campuses. There was a report this morning that an Israeli student at Columbia was assaulted after posting flyers on campus with images of hostages or victims of Hamas. Another important aspect of the experience that we're hearing from students on campus right now is that they feel more isolated and abandoned than ever by university leadership that's failing to speak out forcefully and clearly to condemn the Hamas violence. As a whole, that's the message we're hearing. And of course, this silence from university leadership comes at a time when Jewish students are being exposed to the kind of glorification and celebration of Hamas's violence that I've described by other students on campus. One student, I think, said it very well when this student told us that while the university is offering sometimes support in the form of platitudes, what they really need, what these students need, is the university to come out and clearly condemn Hamas as a terrorist organization, condemn their murderous actions, state they're wrong, and that they stand with the Jewish and Israeli community on campus. And on too many campuses, we're hearing that from Jewish and Israeli students that that's just not happening, even when administrations are aware that groups like Students for Justice in Palestine are glorifying and justifying Hamas's violence. I did want to mention that there are, and Ken alluded to this in his opening remarks, there have been several universities that have issued good statements, and we've heard positive, supportive responses from universities, like at the University of Florida and Emory. These are statements that clearly and forcefully condemn Hamas atrocities, and they state that they stand with the people of Israel or with the Jewish community during their time of grief. But we've also seen universities like Northwestern that have actually come out and said, we're not going to issue a statement. We're just not going to issue an institutional statement or get involved. And this, by the way, at Northwestern in particular, the SJP had posted on Instagram that the occupied and oppressed have the undeniable right to resist and seek their freedom without stigmatization as as instigators and terrorists. So the university leadership is refusing to speak out at a university where SJP is justifying Hamas's violence. We've also heard from students that on some universities, they've had to make actually tremendous efforts to convince the university leadership to even speak out. Sometimes the ultimate statement is simply inadequate. It's weak. It doesn't. It equates both sides, or it doesn't call Hamas out as a terrorist organization, or its actions as being terrorist actions and wrong. But students are saying that it takes tremendous amount of effort sometimes to actually go through back channeling in order to get the university to simply issue a statement condemning Hamas's murderous actions. And so the overwhelming message that we're getting from students is a feeling of sadness and isolation while they experience grief, and a lack of support from university administrators and leaders, a lack of meaningful support, and a lack of public outcry over the brutality and the horrific acts that we've seen unfold in Israel over the last week. Lastly, I'll just mention that students are also telling us that in their grief and in their anguish and in their worry, they are so distraught over events. Some of them are asking their professors, they're asking for extensions and they can't go to class. It's not just that they are sometimes leaving campus, they simply are asking for accommodations and they're not always getting them. So that's another concern and another issue that we're seeing from students, that we're hearing from students and seeing on campus right now. I think that paints, for now, a picture of what we're hearing from students, what we're seeing on campus over the last week. And I'll turn things over now to Mark.
Thank you, Denise. And let me say, by way of a quick word of framing for Mark Goldfeder, on many campuses, we are hearing misleading or ignorant statements about international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, that are intended, it appears, to cast Israel in a bad light and to insulate Hamas from culpability. In order to have a better understanding of the legal context, we bring to you Mark Goldfeder.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to first echo Ken and everyone else's sense of profound grief and sadness. And I want to echo Denise's points and also make clear that we simply cannot let it become normalized for people to support terrorism. Now, for the first few days of this week, while the images of the horrors were still fresh, the international law community was somewhat rocked back into silence. But predictably, they have now come out in full force and are starting to accuse Israel of war crimes for responding to Hamas. And on social media and on campus, there's a lot of legal misinformation that's being spread by those who either do not understand or more likely are purposely misusing and misapplying the rules when it comes to discussing Israel and Hamas. But the law is designed to create a framework that can help us make some sense of the chaos of war. And it's important that any and all of these discussions remain firmly grounded in the facts. And it's important for all of us to have a basic understanding of what the law actually is. Let's start with the following. Israel is currently defending itself against a foreign invasion by Hamas, which is a US-designated terrorist organization with a genocidal mission to A, destroy the state of Israel, and B, separately and apart, to kill every single Jewish man, woman, and child on earth. It's not hyperbole, it's literally in their founding charter. Last weekend, they acted on that charge. Hamas terrorists carried out the largest mass killing of Jews since the Holocaust. They kidnapped, raped, tortured, and desecrated human bodies. They beheaded babies, they took the elderly and the infants hostage. They broke every standard of basic human decency, and they also violated every fundamental principle of international humanitarian law, also known as the law of war or the law of armed conflict. Now, the central feature of the law of armed conflict is to prevent unnecessary casualties and protect innocent civilians. And it does this primarily through the application of three fundamental governing principles: the principles of distinction, military necessity, and proportionality. Perhaps the most basic rule of international humanitarian law, and it's actually the very first rule in the manual of customary international humanitarian law, is the principle of distinction. The principle of distinction requires that the parties to a conflict must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants. Attacks may only be directed against combatants. Attacks must not be directed against civilians. Now, Hamas completely and unabashedly disregards every aspect of that convention and films themselves killing innocent and helpless non-combatants. Nevertheless, the IDF does remain firmly committed to that rule of law and will not target civilians. Per independent experts at the Lieber Institute for Law and Warfare at West Point, there is not any credible evidence or reliable reports that IDF has intentionally targeted civilians in this conflict. Now, that does not mean that Israel is not responding forcefully to Hamas, and it does not mean that there won't be additional tragic loss of innocent life as a result of Israel's response. The principle of military necessity permits measures which are actually necessary to accomplish a legitimate military purpose and are not otherwise prohibited by international humanitarian law. Now, the International Committee of the Red Cross explains, almost by definition, military necessity runs counter to humanitarian exigencies, right? So the purpose of humanitarian law is to strike a balance between military necessity, doing what you have to do, and humanitarian exigencies. And that balance is struck by operation of the third fundamental principle, which is the principle of proportionality. The principle of proportionality forbids attacks in which the expected incidental loss of civilian life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects or any combination thereof would be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage gained. And this is the principle that is most often misunderstood. So let me be clear about what proportionality is not. The calculus in proportionality is not about revenge or punishment, right? It's not about striking back against your enemy in proportion to how hard you were hit. And it's also not a capabilities comparison where you try to balance the weaponry or the technology on both sides. Or it's not an effects-based relative comparison where you look at the amount of damage or the number of dead bodies on both sides. That kind of perverse reasoning, by the way, is why Hamas continues to engage in the use of human shields. They'll murder their own women and children to artificially widen that asymmetry because people think that's what disproportionality means, but it's not. What proportionality is, it's a prospective analysis which legally permits the risk of collateral damage that is necessary to achieve a just military objective. Now, the greater the military objective, the greater the extent of the permitted risk of incidental damage or even, God forbid, death. So as it relates to Israel's current operations, what is the legitimate military purpose? To wipe out Hamas, which is a genocidal terrorist organization that indiscriminately kills both Israeli and Palestinian men, women, and children. And aside from the international humanitarian principle of self-defense, under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Israel arguably has an affirmative obligation on behalf of the entire world and the entire international community to prevent and punish their genocide. So saving millions of lives from terrorists who would demonstrably, brutally end those lives if given the slightest chance is what you would call an overwhelmingly necessary and just military objective. Again, that does not mean Israel should not do everything it can to minimize casualties, which is why Israel is taking important measures, including warning civilians to leave endangered areas before attacks. Now, of course, that's made more difficult by the fact that Hamas is continuing to hide munition stores in hospitals and in schools. By the way, another important rule, which is a corollary to the principle of distinction, requires that combatants actually distinguish themselves from the civilian population through distinctive insignia or the use of clearly identified military vehicles, etc. Hamas obviously does not do that. What it does mean, though, is that any unavoidable loss of life or collateral damage on either side is entirely on Hamas's account. It was caused by their decisions and their actions, and it was not caused by Israel's legitimate, necessary, and proportionate response to those actions. Again, to be clear, any loss of innocent life is tragic, but sometimes it is lawful. Both things can be true. And as Israel continues to exercise its right to defend its existence, it is very likely that both things will be true. You might have heard people throw around the term collective punishment. The Geneva Convention prohibits any armed reprisals that are intentionally inflicting collective punishment against civilian populations, as well as the targeting of non-military targets. Israel has done nothing of the sort. A proportional response is by definition not collective punishment. When it comes to the siege and the blockade, it is not true that a proportional blockade is a war crime. Now, of course, siege law does have humanitarian aspects, right? Both the Geneva and the Hague Conventions include instructions on conducting sieges during an international law conflict. The basic rule that they outline is that sieges are lawful unless they're deliberately aimed at starving the local population. Again, Israel's aims repeatedly are not to starve civilians, but to defeat Hamas terrorists by depriving them of the resources they have and to rescue the hostages. Now, siege law does have humanitarian aspects, including facilitating the passage of food and medicine by third parties, but that is if and only if they can be reliably delivered without diversion to the enemy. That's not always the case here. In terms of water, there are three sources of water in Gaza. 92% of the water in Gaza is actually secured from their own aquifer. 6% is purchased from Israel, and 2% comes through seawater desalination. In terms of food and humanitarian aid, again, if you look very closely at a map, you will see that Gaza is not surrounded by Israel. In fact, it shares a border with Egypt. Egypt is actually discussing plans to send aid and food over that border. In terms of electricity, again, electricity is vital to Hamas's continued attacks against Israel. And just so you understand, there is no provision in the law of armed conflict which says you must keep handing your enemy more bullets so it's fair. Okay, and for the record, Israel has had absolutely no responsibility to supply water, food, or electricity to Gaza since it withdrew in 2005. Arguably, for 2 years under various conventions, the government would have had 2 years to set it up. So let's call it 2007. Israel's had no responsibility to provide any of those things, and they've done it out of the kindness of their hearts. So to conclude, as Israel does what it needs to do, proportionately, we hope and pray that God protects the innocent, because we know that whatever happens, Hamas will not.
Thank you, Mark Goldfeder. So now the question is, on college campuses, which are in some cases seeing some very disturbing activity, what can be done, what should be done, what must be done? And for those questions, we turn to our last speaker, the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center, Eliza Lewin.
Thank you, Ken. I want to start first by saying to those who are listening, and to those you may share this video with at the end, we're here at the Brandeis Center to help and to support you through this difficult time. We have been hearing from students, family members, concerned community members. We're here. So please reach out and contact us. Our email address is info@brandeiscenter.com. That's one of the simplest, quickest ways to reach us. The question about what universities should do. Well, I'll start by saying that very soon after this webinar, we are about to send out to every single university president in the United States, that's under over 500 universities, a letter that is being signed by all the major national Jewish organizations and was drafted by the Brandeis Center, urging the universities to take certain steps to ensure the safety and security of their Jewish and Israeli students on campus, and to provide the needed support and accommodations during this time. not only because it's the morally right thing to do, but because these universities are legally obligated to take certain steps. So what are some of the things that these universities should be doing? Well, first of all, they should be issuing strong statements that demonstrate support for the Jewish community, but that condemn the actions of Hamas. This is not a situation, and they shouldn't be confused and think that somehow this is a situation where they're being asked to weigh in on some kind of political debate. This is a situation where they are being asked to express moral leadership and condemn the mass slaughter of Jews. And if they hesitate at all, it's shameful. It is shameful. They should at least be able to issue statements as strong as the statement issued the other day by the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy, where those countries said, and I quote, that the terrorist actions of Hamas have no justification, no legitimacy, and must be universally condemned. There is never, and I repeat, never, any justification for terrorism, is what they said. The university presidents ought to be able to issue a statement that's as strong and as forceful. They should be, in addition to issuing these statements and expressing solidarity with the Jewish and Israeli students on their campus, and not just the students, but the faculty and the administrators and their entire Jewish community on campus. They should be making clear that any of these celebrations that are taking place, any of these events that appear to be glorifying this kind of brutality and this kind of these atrocities, they should be making sure that those are not done and don't even appear to be done in the university's name. So they should be making sure that none of those events and none of those posts have the university's name or mark or symbol or sign anywhere attached to them. And they should be making clear that there would even be consequences if their names or marks are used in that fashion. They should be taking steps to ensure the safety and the security, physical safety and security of the Jewish and Israeli students by providing the needed and necessary security for any of the facilities or for any of the gatherings of the Jewish students. We've heard from students who have said they're afraid to even go to events or programs at Chabad or at Hillel, even though there is now in some of those places a guard outside, because they're afraid that any gathering, particularly over these next 2 days, any gathering of any size, any sizable gathering of Jews will become a target. And so they're afraid. The universities have to take this seriously and have to make sure that they are providing the necessary security measures to protect these students from any harm. The universities also need to recognize and address the impact of anti-Semitic hate speech on their campus climate. It is not acceptable anymore to just stand by silently when there is rhetoric that is actually shifting too. And as Mark had said, we can't allow the line to move and for this to become tolerated. We hear from students that the rhetoric on campus, as bad as it has always been, is getting worse in that it's becoming almost more militarized. When you think about some of the terms now that are being used and bantered about, a day of resistance, calling for people to disrupt and to mobilize, the language is getting fiercer and the students are frightened because the language is becoming increasingly threatening. And so universities have to recognize and speak out promptly and condemn clearly any anti-Semitic hate speech. And they need to recognize that the anti-Semitic rhetoric also includes rhetoric that either disparages or demeans Jews as a group, by erasing or denying the Jewish people's historic, shared ancestral and ethnic heritage, particularly the Jews' shared ancestral connection to the land of Israel. So university presidents should be speaking out and condemning any kind of rhetoric that appears to marginalize, shun, isolate, demean, disparage Jewish students on that basis. The administrators should also be taking steps to educate their campus communities on anti-Semitism so that the community can start to recognize anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism that's taking place on campus for what it is. So they should be using, for this purpose, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the IRA definition, because that is not only the global standard definition, a definition that has been, it's the only definition that has been adopted and accepted through a process that involved intergovernmental agencies through a consensus adoption of this definition. And they need to use the definition and understand all the examples that are included in the definition so that they can see and recognize, particularly when anti-Semitism that relates to Israel crosses the line, right, from a legitimate criticism of Israeli policy to anti-Semitic criticism of Jews or Israel as a people. They should also make sure to include Jewish identity and this understanding of anti-Semitism in any of their DEI programming, in their DEI training, in their DEI workshops, in their DEI events. Jews need to be included, and the understanding of anti-Semitism and how it manifests today must be included, must be addressed, and must be recognized in those DEI programs. The administrators should also be reaching out to the Jewish and Israeli students, and I can't stress how important this is, to provide the necessary support and accommodations. As Denise mentioned, we have heard from students who have been overwhelmed by anxiety, by grief, by this trauma, who have found it impossible to engage with the coursework this week. Some of them have had midterms this week. They have asked for accommodations, and we've heard from students who have been refused those accommodations. When universities were so ready to recognize and provide accommodations in the summer of the George Floyd incident, there were even universities that provided accommodations after President Trump was elected president. To deny Jewish and Israeli students today, after what has been going on and what continues to be going on in Israel, is unconscionable. The universities must be offering the necessary support, mental health services, and accommodations to Jewish and Israeli students that they need today. Along those lines, if there are Israeli students, if there are Israelis who need to return to Israel, they may be in the reserves and need to go back in order to defend their homeland. The universities must provide the necessary academic and administrative accommodations to those students to enable them to go back and to return. And then one more thing, the universities must apply their own policies to make sure and hold accountable any students who violate those policies. So if we see things happening on campus where students are violating the university's anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies, their codes of conduct, the universities must enforce those and protect the Jewish students the same way they would protect any other group from harassment and discrimination. They have to do it as vigorously and as robustly. Those are just some of the items that we've included in the letter that we'll be sending out today. And those are things that the students should be asking for and demanding from their administrators today. Again, as I said, if there are students who do experience harassment, discrimination, that they see things on their campus, please reach out to the Brandeis Center. We're here to support you and we're here to help.
Thank you, Elisa. Why don't we bring on the other members of the panel as well? We do have some questions in the Q&A section, and to the extent people have additional questions, feel free to bring them in. We will answer as many as we are able to. I'm going to start with this question. It might have been anticipated, at least in part, by one of the panelists, but an anonymous attendee asks in the first instance of Denise, Denise, what is the Louis D. Brandeis Center doing these days to support Jewish students at this specific juncture and help them protect themselves and organize a cogent and effective response to the situation they find themselves in?
So one of the things that we're doing is to continue to have open communication with students to be able to actually understand for what's going on and provide a strategic response. So we're hearing from students who want assistance with, for instance, drafting communication with administrators, and they want to understand what is the language that I need to use in order to articulate my requests and frame it in a way that makes the university understand that I can demand certain things because I have certain civil rights. And that's something that we do all the time with students. Give them that support, give them that the language and the resources to be able to advocate for themselves once they understand what and once we discuss what are their rights and what they can demand in certain situations. One of the things that I meant to include this in my remarks, that I'm hearing from students, the same students who are reaching out to us, for instance, this week, to talk about what's going on campus, is that while they do feel scared and they do feel distraught, they really are looking to push back. And so, and do something to voice some sort of, opposition and to actually get the administrators to do the right thing. They're not giving up. And so I do encourage, as Elisa said, students, or if family members who are in school, to reach out to the Brandeis Center so that we can work together to discuss what kinds of things, the ways that students can actually respond and push back. We also have established a national membership organization. It's Jewish Americans for Fairness in Education. And I would encourage, as I do, students, faculty, parents, family members who have been impacted in some way by anti-Semitic discrimination on campus, or those who have experienced it, to join our national membership organization, where we can have a more sort of intimate discussion and about strategic responses, and figure out, have an open line of communication. We can figure out what students are actually experiencing and how we can push back, whether it's through litigation or other pressures on the university.
Thank you, Denise. Did anyone want to add to that? So let me just add briefly, we're doing a lot of things right now as others are doing. This is a tragic time. It's also an intense time. Elisa described the joint letter that we've drafted working with several of our partners. We've worked on other letters and statements that other institutions are submitting. We are, as Denise said, working with students to help them get through this situation, but we're also monitoring to see if there are institutions that need to be held accountable through legal action, and we're ready for that as well. We've also been working on the corporate front in various ways, including through Shine a Light, to make sure that tools are available for Jewish employees who are facing problems in the workplace. And since I see that there are some congressional staff members here, I'll also say that we've been working with elected officials, and we are quite pleased with some of the strong statements that we've been seeing, excuse me, from the administration, from Congress, and from many of the states. Another question: a couple people ask whether the letter that Elisa mentions will be available to the public. Elisa?
Yes, it will be. Once we send it out, it'll also be up on our website. And I know I have spoken with students and law students and others who want to be able to have that letter to be able to bring to their deans or their administrators, and it will be available for you for that purpose as well. And it does, I mean, one of the things that I didn't go into, but it does talk and mention in the letter briefly the university's obligation under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act 1964 to protect the Jewish students from a hostile environment. And that is the concern, is that these events of these next couple of days will, based on what we've seen happen historically, create such a hostile environment. We have, as Denise has mentioned, we've been concerned about a potential uptick in violence. We saw back in 2021 that that's exactly what happened, that things happen in Israel and then it translates into increased actual physical assaults on Jews in this country and around the world. And so we are we're aware that that's the dangerous progression. And so the universities have to take this concern about a hostile environment.
If any viewers are not getting the Brandeis Center's materials and would like to, feel free to go onto our website, brandeiscenter.com, sign up for the Brandeis Brief and other mailings, and we will be sharing with you copies of this letter and things of this sort. We're getting a lot of questions, which is fantastic. We'll do the best that we can with them. Sharon Dubrow asks, should we be writing letters to the university administrators? Who would like to take that one?
Sure. The answer, I think, is absolutely you should. I think that there's been a paradigm shift in Israel that will never go back, and there should be a paradigm shift here as well, where we start to hold our university officials and administrators and our politicians accountable for the positions that they do and they do not take. And so, yes, I think everyone should, on their own and collectively, write as much as they can and voice their opinions and let it be known that we remember, as Martin Luther King said, remember the silence of our friends too.
Thank you. Stephen Rothschild asks, filing of litigation. I'm not sure if I've answered that already, but I don't know, do people want to address the prospect of litigation?
Litigation is really dependent on each individual case and circumstance. And the Brandeis Center, when people come to us, we evaluate those, each situation on its own, and then determine, what we think based on our professional experience and is the best way to proceed. So sometimes, yes, there are matters that we determine are ripe for a complaint to be filed with the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education. Other matters might be more appropriate for actually a federal lawsuit. Some things might not actually rise to that level, but are things that the universities really need to be addressing. And so sometimes the Brandeis Center will be writing letters to the universities, making sure they're aware and explaining to them why they should. We call it sometimes listen, learn, and lead. Why they should be taking the steps to address this anti-Semitism, because the university administrators have to understand that if they don't address it at the inception, it doesn't go away. As much as they would like to hope that if they just ignore it, it'll end. If they ignore it, it gets worse. And so, so we will do our best to push the universities to take these matters seriously. And I will say that we have seen positive movement in that direction. The Department of Education is taking this kind of harassment and discrimination seriously. They are letting it be known. We've had cases and resolutions of cases that we have filed with the Office for Civil Rights where they have made it clear that, in particular, the kind of anti-Semitism that we're seeing that takes the form of anti-Zionist harassment and discrimination is a form that they will recognize and compel universities to address. And that's been very helpful. And so I think universities are starting to take notice. The sad thing is that I think this week's events are waking up more universities as well.
Thank you. Robert Solomon asks, what is the center hearing from Jewish and Israeli faculty and staff, and what support is it offering to these populations? Someone want to take that one? I'll get it rolling. I'm saying that, yes, we do hear from faculty and staff. There's no question that we hear a lot more from students than from faculty, and that's been the case lately. From faculty, I would say recently the faculty messages that I've gotten have been mostly along the lines of, keep fighting or thank you for what you're doing. We do hear from faculty who have specific concerns about the environment on their campus. I'm not sure that I can think offhand of something that I've seen or heard from a faculty member that is significantly different from what we're hearing from the students.
I would add, Ken, that I think it's really important that faculty and Jewish faculty and students communicate, and that, one of the things I talk to when I have talked to faculty who tell us about the situation that's going on and sort of ask us what they can do, reaching out to students and supporting them and having that open communication between students and professors in sort of an organized and more strategic response to what's going on is helpful.
We have also been working with faculty in the AAA, in the American Anthropology Association, I think, right, where they were recently adopted BDS. And so there are faculty members who have reached out to us for guidance, for questions, legal questions. We have also helped some faculty in the past with Title VII complaints, EEOC complaints. So there are faculty members who, when they've reached out to us, if they've experienced harassment or discrimination, we've provided some legal support and assistance there too.
We have just about 5 minutes left. A few members of the audience have asked about alumni, trustees, and donors. Is this something that we should keep in mind, strategies for addressing these groups, things that these groups can be doing?
These are highly influential groups, the trustees, the alumni, the communities. I think the universities, there are multiple pressure points that universities listen to. One is funding. So trustees and certainly major donors have considerable influence. One is publicity. They don't appreciate some very loud, very negative publicity. And that's an area where alumni are often helpful too and influential in making their voices heard and in publicizing actions that need to be addressed, or their disappointment with universities. So yes, I would encourage all of those communities to not hesitate to speak out and to express your position. And if you are looking for guidance or how to best engage or what the messaging might be, the best way perhaps to frame it so that the university understands and sees the anti-Semitism for what it is, you're also welcome to reach out to us, and we can try and help you there.
We've also gotten a question or two about what parents could or should do about anti-Semitism in the public schools, including one asked specifically about Montgomery County, Maryland, but I think the question is also more general.
It's kind of a common refrain, reach out to the Brandeis Center, but we have been dealing also with anti-Semitism, unfortunately, in K through 12, in the middle schools, in the high schools. We've seen some of it also in Montgomery County and elsewhere in the country. We've also been very engaged in the ethnic studies matter in California. We have filed a a complaint out there in California addressing problems with the way some of the liberated ethnic studies curriculum have been adopted or advanced there. So so yes, you know, parents, if you are seeing this in the middle schools or high schools, if you're aware of situations of anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination, you can reach out to us as well. I should also say that we have law school programs. I don't know how many law school students are on here, but we do have opportunities if there are law students who, after listening to this, are interested in learning more about the anti-discrimination laws, the all the kind of the legal pieces that we've been talking about here, and want to know more about how to really try and help support and guide other students. We have a variety of programs for law school students, our leadership programs. We have opportunities for law students to work at the Brandeis Center to serve as law clerks. We have opportunities for students to create chapters on their law school campuses, Brandeis Center chapters, where you could help host events and get out some of the narrative that explains anti-Semitism. And we also have our Jigsaw Fellows, our Justice Initiative guiding student activists worldwide, which are our law students who go through a special training in order to be able to really work with and help support the undergraduate students who are experiencing the anti-Semitism on campus. And they volunteer, and their hours are counted towards their pro bono requirements if they need that. So please reach out to us if you're a law student interested in working with the Brandeis Center.
As we bring this to the close, I guess I should say that there was one member of the audience who thanks us for the work we're doing for the Jewish people. And then I assume this is directed at the panelists in particular, says that everybody has been brilliant today. And I would agree that with that proposition as described to the panelists. I'll also say there was one person who asked about resources on Title VI. I will say that our website, brandeiscenter.com, has resources on that. You can see on our front page, for example, we have various fact sheets and guides, including a short guide to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We are now at the end of our hour. I thank our panelists for their participation. I thank all of you for joining, and I would reiterate, as our president, Eliza Lewin, said, that we at the Brandeis Center are here, we're available, we are working with students, with professors, with others, to the extent that you or someone that you know is dealing with anti-Semitism on or off college campuses, please reach out to us at info@brandeiscenter.com. Once again, we are here to help. Thank you and take care.